Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Climate and Pollinator Initiatives at the USDA by Izzy Hill, USDA Pollinator Coordinator. My name is Jenna Tots, Education Coordinator at the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm joined by my coworker, Alyssa Taylor, Program Manager for the MJV. We want to thank our sponsors for their support of this webinar series. Supporting sponsors Reinvent Your Waste and CPKC, and community sponsors East Central Energy, Hedgerow Farms, and NiSource. We appreciate your support and dedication to monarch conservation. Before we get started, we just have a few community guidelines and helpful hints to make this webinar successful for everyone. During the webinar, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, that is disabled, found at the bottom of the screen. We'll collect those for the Q&A at the end. Please use reactions during the presentation. Izzy is able to see those reactions, which makes it a fun way to engage. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the MJV website by Friday of this week. The entire MJV Monarch Conservation Webinar Series is free and available to watch on that site. It contains 9 years worth of monarch conservation webinars. So you should be able to find something that is of interest to you beyond today's webinar. If you're joining us today but did not register for the webinar, we'd like to count you for attendance. You can email myself at learn@monarchjointventure.org with your name and email address. We want to remind you that there are translated captions as well as just closed captioning for this Zoom call. If you'd like to add those in a language other than English, click on the arrow on captions and be sure the translation button is on, then choose your caption language. And finally, all of our webinar speakers represent their own viewpoints, which are not necessarily those of the Monarch Joint Venture. And now I'd love to introduce our speaker today. Elizabeth, or Izzy Hill, is the USDA Pollinator Coordinator for the Office of the Chief Scientist. In this role, she promotes collaboration between USDA, federal agencies, the commercial pollinator industry, and USDA grant recipients. Izzy previously was an agricultural economist in the Office of the Chief Economist's Office of Pest Management Policy, where, among other duties, she examined the interface between the needs of agricultural pest management and pollinator protection. Welcome, Izzy. Stop sharing here, and you have the board here.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for having me today. I'm really excited to chat with you. I had mentioned to Jenna and Alyssa that some of this material's never been presented before, so I'm really excited to share it with you. And I'm also would love your feedback on how to make sure some of these messages are best presented. So feel free to follow up with me afterwards. My email will be at the end of the presentation. And again, thank you for your time today. And let us, and just really quickly, my findings are, or excuse me, anything presented here are the opinions of myself and not that of USDA. And I will also mention quickly, I will be in some cases presenting other people's research here at USDA, which I hope I don't botch. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the PI and researchers that worked on those projects. Okay. So nothing new here, that we know that to really start to tackle problems, we need to, or excuse me, to think about solutions, we really need to think about and understand the problem first, right? So at a very high level, and there's many examples of this, I'm only presenting one here from our climate adaptation and resilience plan here at USDA. Although again, there's many other pieces of guidance, et cetera, that get into this, but we here at USDA really are trying to have all hands on deck as we think about how to coordinate both across research and policies and policy and programmatic areas to begin making ourselves resilient and having our sails open for what might be happening to our pollinator communities as climate stress gets worse. So again, this is just an example, but like anything, what really matters, oops, sorry. What really matters are the details. So these details really quite vary, right? It could be details about the plants. It could be details about the pollinators. It could be details about something like climatic change projections, which are really tricky if you've worked in this realm before. It could be changes in land use that we're, potentially trying to project and may not be able to capture. It can be details about policies and programs, and the list goes on. And so for today, what I would really like to do, even though there's many other considerations for climate and pollinators, for example, interactions between pests and pathogens, etc. We're going to set that aside for now. And I really want to focus more on what I see as one of the biggest issues in all of this, which is the interaction of pollinators with plants. And so we will take the next hour or so, a little less than that, to chat about this. And I'm very excited to hear about your comments when we're done. And although there's many P's in the pollinator world, we usually talk about the 4 P's in terms of stressors for pollinators. But in this particular case, we're going to talk about the 3 P's of pollinators in the context of climate adaptation. And those P's are plants, pollinators, and of course, people. So with that said, let's go through these 3 parts separately, because I think that's going to help frame some of this conversation. And so starting with plants, there's so many considerations here when we're talking about pollinators and climatic stress, but specifically for plants, there's so many ways that they can vary in terms of for example, a nutritional composition of plants. There's also considerations around what types of plants certain types of pollinators like, right? There's preferences, just like humans have preferences. There's considerations around what the ranges are for these plants, what the environmental context is within where these plants are growing that can drive their resiliency. And of course, there's also going to be conversations and considerations around things like phenology and bloom time, and all the other ways that the timing of things can be changed. So, and I'm going to get better at advancing these slides, so I apologize. Okay, so diving into plants, I just wanted to present to you guys a few examples of research. So the first here is research that was done on drought stress to clover. And in this particular study by Rankin, we see a decrease in the volume of nectar, the decrease in the bricks, the decrease in the pollen weight, and even a decrease in the pollen protein concentration. So we do know in studies, and this is definitely a burgeoning area where there's more and more research being done, but we know that climate, specifically in terms of drought, but also in terms of temperatures, can have huge impacts on the nutritional composition of plants. So this can have downstream effects on our pollinators and their health. All right. Oops. And I also want to mention quickly that there's a USDA Grand Challenge occurring. So this is being led by Dr. Gloria DeGrande Hoffman, who is the research leader for our USDA ARS Tucson lab. And this is a massive grand challenge. If you're interested, I believe there's 18 projects associated with it. And for us here at USDA, grand challenges are a big deal. You have to go through a board, you have to get approved for these. It's a whole thing, and it's a very big honor to have one accepted. And so we're excited that this one is one of the few grand challenges that are recognized by the USDA Agricultural Research Service. So specifically, this is looking at pollinator landscapes and overwintering practices, which is more in the honeybee world, but also of interest for other pollinators in terms of increasing our populations in a changing climate. So not a small task. This is an incredible group of researchers that are working on this, and I want to highlight just a couple of things from here. For example, Dr. Vanessa Corby-Harris, who is also in our Tucson lab with Gloria, has conducted research looking at variations in plant nutrition This specific study that I'm covering is regarding sunflowers, and we've known for a long time that lines of sunflowers can differ in terms of the nutritional composition that they offer, but there are also factors such as external exogenous environmental factors that can influence how much nutrition is offered by a sunflower as well. And so in this study, Vanessa looked at sunflowers being grown in two very different parts of the country with identical lines of sunflowers, and found that with these differences in climatic stress, it altered the fatty acid content of the sunflower. And just like us, bees very much depend on proper ratios of omega 3 to 6, because this can actually impact their cognitive functions. And so this is of very high importance to better understand this. Again, this is a new area of research. There's not a lot being done here yet, but I think it's going to be key for us in making optimal choices of how we proceed in supporting our landscapes for pollinator health. I also want to mention that there's additional research looking at specific bee species that have preferences for specific omega-3/6 ratios. So some of those plant pollinator interactions with specialists could be impacted because it could be changing how desirable that plant is for a pollinator and the nutrition it offers to them. I also want to highlight a study that is being conducted by Sarah Gossley and Gabriella Quinlan here at USDA ARS. And so with climate effects, we know that it's going to begin to limit the ranges in which we can grow oilseed crops like canola. I mean, this is going to apply to all crops, but this specific study is looking at oilseed crops. And so as an alternative to canola, Sarah, and Gabriella are working together to look and see how these ranges are going to be changing for canola, but also for a substitute oilseed crop that could be used, which is camelina. And as you can see in these maps that have been produced, there's likely going to be a decrease in both crops in terms of where the ranges are, but the decrease is going to be greater for canola. And there's a lot of considerations around this. And of course, this is something that probably needs to be conducted for all crops. But as mentioned before, there's details and things like climate models. So this is going to be an ongoing effort as we learn more about how to be doing proper modeling. But this is a great example of the type of research that we need to do to better understand crops, especially those that are highly supportive of pollinator health, and making sure that these plants are going to continue in some form or fashion, even if it's a different species, to support pollinator nutritional access. I also want to mention on the same line of plant nutrition. So pictured here is Priya Chakrabarti Basu and also Ramesh Sagili. Priya is with Mississippi State and Ramesh is with Oregon State University. And both of them are very interested in the nutritional offerings of plants. You may not be familiar with them because they're more so in the honeybee world, but nutrition is one of those beautiful areas where all pollinator researchers can come together and benefit. And so I had just mentioned two different plants, that can be impacted by climate. But here in their study, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry, guys. There we go. Instead of looking at just a couple of plants, they're actually looking at the nutritional composition for over 100 plant species. So this is a big deal. And for any of those that have ever done pollen collection, this is not the easiest thing in the world. They are just starting with pollen for right now, but of course, in the future, there's the opportunity to also look at nectar. And the types of nutrients that are being considered are micronutrients, and everything related to that. And so what's really exciting here is that they're looking at 100 plants, they're doing sampling, but we realized that with the cost of, with a few dollars spent on dry ice and packaging, we can actually begin to do additional pollen collections to get a better hold and understanding on how these nutrients are going to vary. And again, we're focusing on pollen right now. How's that going to vary across the country, depending on where you are? And at all those exogenous variables, including climate, that can impact plants. And so we conducted a pilot in 2023, and this was in partnership with Oregon State, Mississippi State, USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, 4-H. We had tribal members, extension reps, and pollinator organizations. And we did a 3-day training to demonstrate how we can actually do these collections with different groups. And so this pilot's been put on hold because of resource constraints, but it's very promising. And I just want to put the note out there, if we do have anyone that's interested in doing pollen collection, please reach out to me, because this is always a need for our labs, and it's just going to continue. And it's going to be huge for us in terms of understanding and making optimal decisions about what plants to put in certain places. All right. And on that same note, as we start to generate more information about the characteristics of these plants, we realized that we needed a one-stop shop repository for housing all of this. And so it hit us one day, our collective group here at USDA, that wait a second, we already have a repository for plant characteristics, and it's called the USDA Plants Database. It is managed by NRCS. It has over 36,000 plant species in it. It does not account at this time for crops. But that's unless they are occurring wildly, but that's a place to look in the future. But for now, what NRCS is doing is adding if you can see this little box, additional characteristics information on pollinators. And so in addition to information on the attractiveness of certain plants to pollinators, we're going to start getting into pollinator species and their interactions with plants, so that can be in one place. This is really more of a scraping exercise from others that have already done collections on plant pollinator interactions. But further, what's really exciting is we're also going to be hosting information here on nutritional information associated with those plants. So here I'm showing you, this is a pull from the current types of characteristics information. This is just a common sunflower that are hosted in the plants database, but you can see we'll be adding, for example, nutritional characteristics, so that we can begin to understand the micro and macronutrients that are offered by a specific plant species. And so this information is going to be critical as we start moving forward, again, trying to make these optimal decisions that are going to best support different pollinator species. I also want to mention quickly some really interesting research. So for those of you who like to do remote sensing or spatial analyses, we had a team, I believe it was last year, with Melanie Kemmer and Jesse Tabor and John Koch, who began flying aerial drones to be taking images of the landscapes and then reclassifying that to be able to understand what types of pollinator species are growing there. So this is really exciting. There's been some other efforts, I believe, out of Clint Otto's lab as well at USGS. But essentially what's happening is the ability to do these quick reclasses to say, okay, like that's Agastache, or, that's Helianthus, or whatever it is. And it's getting more and more accurate because of the precision of these drones. And also the drones are getting quite fast in terms of how much land they can cover at one time. So I'm quite excited personally to see where this is going to be going in the next 5 to 10 years. But it's going to help us not only understand what's on the landscape now, but perhaps what would be ideal changes to make on the landscapes, and also ways to assess whether plantings, for example, that might be put in the ground. I always think of our own land management groups like NRCS and their working lands, or with our Farm Service Agency and Conservation Reserve Program. But of course, there's many other land management programs out there. But to be able to know if a planting worked 5 years later is going to be key for us in being adaptive in our decisions for what plants to put in the ground and where. Okay, so that was plants, and we're going to pivot now to pollinators. And really this gets interesting, and I want to focus for a minute on some brand new research that's been published in the Journal of Nature. So this one thing before we get into that is that an increase in bee diversity usually is associated with an increase in plant pollination. This is not always the case, but it often is the case. And what's interesting with climatic stress is that we are seeing community reordering. And I will push the right button one day. Here we go. And because of this reordering, we do have winners and losers in these bee communities. And so this new study out in Nature, and I recommend you take a peek at it. It's a really fascinating research. We also had some of our folks here, like Terry Griswold at ARS, working on this, but it's a 16-year abundance pattern study. And essentially and this was in, I believe, 9 different ecoregions. And essentially what they were seeing was what you would expect, that with increases in drought, you do start to see these declines in the number of declines in bee species. And so within this study, they saw 46% of bee species declining due to drought. They also saw that across, and they looked at 665 different bee populations, which is amazing. But that aridity strongly predicted bee abundance for 71% of these populations. So that's quite interesting. And so where this leads our researchers is to a place where there's already been research, but it's just gelling up more, which is that bee traits really likely matter. So things like the ability of a bee to be resistant to desiccation, what size the bee is, et cetera. So all these things can come into play when we're trying to figure out how resilient a bee is going to be when it's facing climate stress. And then, of course, there's going to be these changes in those populations that are able to withstand the pressure. So really fascinating work here. I highly recommend you check out that study. And in the same vein, this is part of the same study and researchers, is a focus that I wanted to just mention because it's so fascinating about the Mojave poppy bee. And you may or may not have heard of this bee. It is very rare. I believe it's ESA listed, and it is a specialist that focuses on the Las Vegas bear poppy. Okay, so as part of this longitudinal study that I just mentioned, what's really fascinating is that this particular bee species can hedge its ability to stay in diapause for multiple years. And so in this particular study, it was 3 years. I've heard from others that they've seen it even longer than that. And so this is really fascinating to learn that bees have certain genes that can allow for them to extend their diapause. And so for this particular bee, this has been a long-standing situation where these bear poppies don't come out every year. This is not a new thing. And so these bees have evolved to deal with this pressure. All right. In the same vein of bees adapting, which is absolutely fascinating to me, is work done by Dr. Lindsay McCabe here at USDA ARS, or Ag Research Service, sorry for the acronyms, is that if you look across generations, for Osmia lignaria specifically, they are able to adapt to local conditions if you give them another generation's opportunity. So you can see here in these graphs that they pulled in blue orchard bees from Utah, Washington, and California. The HB is honeybee, but they pulled them all into California almonds. So they're all in California. And in the very first year, the California populations did better, right? And they're from that area, so it makes sense. But after being reared in the California temperatures, the other 2 populations did as well as the California populations. So this is really fascinating when we start to get into the second year females. And she's still working on it, but I just wanted to give a nod to some of the research that she's doing right now looking at changes in sexual atrias, specifically that there's more males and lower progeny due to drought, and temperatures on solitary bees. So lots of interesting research coming out, especially regarding how bees themselves are adapting to climatic stress, and more on that in the coming months and years for sure. With all that said, though, and again, we're focusing on pollinators at this point, is how do we begin to pull together all of the many monitoring efforts into something that's cohesive and longitudinal in nature. And so I wanted to give a quick kudos to the National Native Bee Monitoring Network. This was funded by our National Institute for Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, who have done years of work on pulling together some great collaborations and also strategies for how we could have a united monitoring network across the United States. And so I wanted to mention that this is a huge undertaking. And you can see in this little frame up top for dimensions for funders, which is a paid subscription we have here at USDA, that I just did a search for plant pollinator interactions. It came up with over 4,000 data sets and 116,000 publications. So no small feat. And we have been working, not intentionally, but we have been working to some degree in silos. But I think we're now getting to some points of technology where we can start to build some bridges. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I did want to mention this initiative. And I also wanted to mention the Big Bee initiative, which is Katja Seltman and her team. And in addition to pulling together a lot of information on plant pollinator interactions, they're also quite interested in bee traits, which, as we mentioned before, we're thinking have lots of connections to resilience to climatic stress. So more on that, but a huge kudos to both these groups for the work they're doing. I also wanted to give a shout out to our Genome 100 project. This is being led by Drs. Jay Evans and Michael Brandstetter, although there's over 80 people working on this particular project. And the goal is to figure out the genomes for over 100 bees, hence the Genome 100. And they are, I believe they've already hit 100. And even though this says 82 species sequenced, I think it's actually more than that at this point. It's going to go beyond 100. That was just the goal. So they continue to work on this. And the beauty of this is that we're going to be able to understand some of, these genes that might be associated with resiliency in certain bees. So we'll be able to look at something that perhaps was done for Osmia lignaria and understand if similar or identical genes might be in Perditas, et cetera. So really exciting. This is going to introduce a whole new world of abilities to understand, again, bee resiliency to climate, but also to a lot of other questions too, like how resilient particular bees might be to things like pest and pathogen pressures or other environmental stressors. Okay. And I'm not going to get into details on this, but I'm going to mention this in passing. And if you've not seen Diana Cox Foster give a talk on this 3-year study on interactions, I highly recommend you catch one with her. She's always happy to talk to any group about it. But the takeaway from this is that everything boils down to carrying capacity. And there's a lot of things that can influence carrying capacity. So coming back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation is that we've got to make sure we have healthy landscapes, resilient landscapes that have diverse plants and diverse nutrition. And so again, feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you with Diana, but I just wanted to put that out there of the importance of having really, really high carrying capacities for our lands, because that can help reduce some of the stress from other interactions. All right, so we did plants, we did pollinators, and now we're going to do the third P, which is people, and it's probably the trickiest of all. I'm going to give you a few stats really quick. So sorry to bore you with these, but as you probably know, primary drivers for biodiversity loss is habitat loss and fragmentation. But you have to think about the secondary part of that, which is that the primary driver for habitat loss and fragmentation is climatic stress and land use change, all right, which are two things that people have a lot of clout over. So with that said, and remember, I'm from U.S. Department of Agriculture, so I have an agricultural lens on all of this, which is that 44% of our lands here in the United States, give or take a little bit, are in agricultural production. 15% of that is cropland, 29% is grassland, pasture, rangeland, okay? And on top of that, 11% of US lands are in forest, of which 61% is National Forest Service, all right? So sorry for all the numbers, but I'm telling you this because I want to get to this, which is that more than half of our acres here in the United States have the potential to be influenced by a USDA or US Forest Service policy or program, okay? So it's immense. Of course, that is the maximum ability for our influence, but it's a huge amount of land and there's a huge potential there for making a big difference in terms of pollinator health. All right. And no surprise to any of you, I'm sure, that work in the pollinator world, which is that seed is expensive. Part of the economic drivers of this is that there is a lot of issues in terms of producers on knowing the supply and demand around seed. We've had conversations with seed producers who say, you know, by the time you know what to grow, everyone else is growing it, so the price plummets, and then that's not what a land manager needs anymore. So there's this disconnect in terms of understanding seed prices, which again is going to interfere with the availability and supply of seed and need. All right. The other thing to think about too is that we have a lot of boots on the ground here at USDA. So in most areas, we have our NRCS field offices along with FSA technicians. And so the ability for us to really get feedback from what's happening at a local level, but also be informing those at the local level with modeling and other efforts is high. So this is definitely an area that we're thinking about and always looking at ways to do improved coordination to really support what's happening on the ground and not just talking about it in a boardroom, right? All right, and I mentioned the RCN again, but I wanted to also mention that we have a native bee monitoring task force. So this is a great effort here to really begin to understand how we can coordinate as people. So coming back to this people point, coordination is everything. And without it, we end up working in silos and not being able to be transparent about our information. I also want to give a quick shout out on the coordination front, specifically to the Fish and Wildlife Service in their analysis of the Monarch and its endangered species status assessment. This is a great example of where, in my opinion, having worked on ESA issues for 15 plus years, this has been an excellent experience in terms of the collaborations between Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners, including USDA. So the energy is there, right? But sometimes as we're going to talk about in a minute, I think there's places for improvements in some of the tools. So this was a success for sure because it's a smaller group. We all know each other, everything's working out, but how do we start to work across things when we have a lot of different partners and sometimes it may be less obvious what is current research, what's best available science, etc. So this is what it feels like to me when you ask me about the coordination across all of these types of research, all of these bees, all of these plants, all of these players. I mean, there's a lot going on. But like a Jackson Pollock painting, there's always some sense in the madness. And so it's just trying to figure that out is the key. And so for me, thinking about all of these efforts, again, across plants and pollinators and people, to me, we really can shoot to improve our meeting of our goals, depending on our ability to access the best available science, our ability to understand what the policies and programs are, and whether or not they are as good as they can be, And then also the best program execution, right? So the boots on the ground, making sure they have the right resources, the right information to be making informed decisions. And so, as was mentioned, my background is environmental economics. And so I really see this as an economic dilemma. And for any of you who've had to take Econ 101, this is truly an allocation of scarce resources amongst competing wants and needs, and how do we do that in an optimal manner? And so with that, I'm going to dive into a new project. You're the first ones to see this publicly, and there'll be much more to come, which is that we are working on, and again, oops, sorry, I keep forgetting to advance that slide. A new pilot, which we're actually finalizing this week for the pilot part of it, which is to demonstrate how knowledge graphs, specifically spatial knowledge graphs, can be used to support habitat optimization. All right. So no worries if you don't know what a knowledge graph is. I will discuss this for a minute. And if you have worked with knowledge graphs before, stay tuned, because this is a little bit different than probably what you've done with them in the past. All right, so here's an example of a knowledge graph, essentially what it is, and a specific language around it. So we're talking about entities, which are technically nodes, and all of the relationships and the characteristics of relationships that can exist between entities. And an entity can be anything. It could be a collaborator, it could be a bee, it could be a plant, it could be, you name it, it could be a soil type, anything you want, right? But it's all about the relationships amongst these entities, all right? And so Esri, if you've worked in the geospatial realm, has taken what has existed for some time, which is knowledge graphs, so the actual platforms in which you can create these relationships. For those of you that are from the taxonomy world, you've probably seen this before. It's often used for controlled language and other applications. But for here, what Esri has done is taken this and integrated it into their spatial platform. So it's become this incredibly powerful tool where you can not only think about things within the relationship functionality, but also in terms of spatial analyses. So that's where our pilot has gone, in that we are looking at specifically how can we optimize pollinator habitat using these tools. And so, as I mentioned, it's going to be a combination of a knowledge graph, which is then ingested into ArcGIS for spatial analysis. So it's really exciting what you can do with that. And so stick with me here, because I had to, and I'm going to try and not mess up the animation this time. Oh, wait, it's the next slide. Sorry. So the next slide, you've been forewarned. This slide's fine, which is that here's the knowledge graph, which I mentioned, coupled with our spatial analysis. And here's what's cool about it, and I forgot to mention this part, is that you can work across a lot of different types of information here. So it's, in this particular case, we're thinking about things like bee monitoring data, interactions data, plant range data, et cetera. But you can account for tabular data, you can account for spatial data, you can even account for things like research publications, like the actual hard documents, or links to those publications. You can think about entities and the collaborator information, which to me is one of the more exciting parts of knowledge graphs, is that you could have a lab, I don't know, over in California working on monarchs, and maybe they don't realize similar research is happening on the East Coast. And are there ways that they can collaborate? That's just an example, right? But we want to make sure that folks are aware of others that are working in the same realm or on the same topics, or that might even be in the same area. Perhaps there's a way to do, a monitoring blitz amongst several people at once that have an interest, for example, in monarchs. And then finally, you can also do things like track policy resources or considerations of the documentation behind that. So it's really a flexible tool in terms of the types of information that can be handled here. All right, so this is the part where I'm going to try and not mess up the animation, which is we've been talking about up to now the USDA pollinator habitat optimization knowledge graph, okay? But what's cool is that we're not the only game in town, right? So, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service is also working on a knowledge graph for endangered species. So that's nice, great. There's two different knowledge graphs, but what is very cool is that, as I mentioned, those entities, right? Those are the little nodes that have connections. If you've got a commonality of an entity, guess what? You can work across knowledge graphs, or at least you can in the near future. This is a new technology that's being developed. Further, so that's great. We can start combining pollinator information, right? So, for example, we might be really interested in Bombus affinis documentation that's being housed in the Fish and Wildlife Service endangered species knowledge graph, but maybe they're really interested in some of what we've got in our knowledge graph, our resulting spatial analyses from our efforts. So really cool that we can start to build this out. And guess what? Anyone can do a knowledge graph. And specifically, Esri is working on the ability to have this work with the more open source knowledge graph so that they can be interoperable, which would be really exciting. So that's on the pollinator front. But again, you don't have to stick to just pollinators. And this is one of the parts where the spatial function of this is very exciting because we at this very same time are working on a soil carbon knowledge graph here at USDA. And although you might think to yourself, like, there's really not that much in common between soil carbon and pollinator habitat, despite the fact that we're always talking about stacked benefits and how important that is. One thing that's very much in common is the lat long, and that's where the spatial component of this is so useful because we can do things like begin to think about stacked benefits. We can start to make better optimization choices, huge increased transparency in what's happening where. And as I mentioned, the collaboration potential here is massive. And so we really get into what's called knowledge management, right? This isn't a knowledge graph. This is knowledge management. It's the whole kit and caboodle of it. So really exciting stuff happening right now. More to come. And what we call this weaving of different knowledge graphs, it has a term. It's called knowledge fabric. And again, more on this front. Very excited to have further conversations if any of you are interested in this. And there's one more little icing on the cake with this, which is that the beauty of knowledge graphs is that you really start to get into controlled language. And when you have that in place, you can start to have very effective generative AI. So this is just an example, not for bees, that I borrowed from an Esri presentation, which if you ever want to take a peek, I'm happy to send you the link to this. But hopefully you can see this. This is a query. I don't know if you guys have worked with Cypher Query at all, but what's cool is you can ask questions. So you can say, for example, what lab has the most amount of projects? And it will tell you, based on the information from the knowledge graph, that there's 7 labs that are working on a particular project of interest. And then you can say, well, how many people have projects? And although it's not shown here, it will tell you that. You can also say things like, I'd like to see where the labs are located. And it will generate, as you can see here, a map of where those labs are located. You could ask something like, show me all the people that work at specific centers. So there's no limit to this, right? It's going to start. I get tingles when I think about where this could go in terms of how this could improve pollinator habitat. And what's interesting too, and I completely skipped over this, is that part of our pollinator habitat optimization knowledge graph is also accounting for climatic change. So we have a researcher named Bryce Hanberry out of the US Forest Service who does future predictions for climate modeling and has a focus on pollinators. And so we've looked at all the pollinator species that will be accounted for in our knowledge graph to look at how these climatic models are going to change, where plants can go, might change, for example, where bees are going to be able to survive, et cetera. So to be able to go into a system like this, especially with generative AI, and imagine yourself as a field office with, I don't know, let's just say NRCS, And you could say, hey, I really want to know what types of plants are going to be good for the types of bees in my area. Let's say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now. And guess what? It can generate that for you. And you could also put in assumptions of, well, what if we think the drought's going to be worse than it has been, et cetera. There's so many ways, like an infinite number of ways you can use this. But in the end, what's going to happen is better decisions where it really matters, which is on the ground where folks are actually putting habitat in. So more on that soon. I'm very, very excited about it if it's not obvious. And this probably won't be the last of what you hear of this, hopefully. And with that, I wanted to just leave you with probably an overused quote, but one of my favorite quotes by John Muir, which is when you tug on a single thing in nature, you find it's attached to the rest of the world. And thank you for your time. And here's my email if you would like it. And I think we have time for questions.
Thank you, Izzy. That was fantastic. We've been collecting the questions and we'll get to those in a minute. We also are collecting some of the resources that you mentioned. So we will include those in the email that will go out on Friday. So if Izzy has other resources, we'll make sure we get all of those for you all. And Alyssa has also put her email in there, so y'all have that. So we'll get into questions here. Again, if we don't answer all of these questions, if we don't have time for all of them, which they are plentiful here, we will get those sent over to Izzy and include those again in the email that goes out on Friday. So we will start here. There's a couple of questions about the pollen collection program volunteering you were looking for. Are there specific regions or states that you need assistance with pollen collection?
That's a great question. So originally, when we started this pilot, we just told folks to go for whatever they can. We're starting to think about having more like collection blitzes where we know it's a certain time of year for, I don't know, like just name a plant and have lots of different folks going out because that's the real value of it. I mean, it's great to have nutritional information, but we also really want to understand how this is differing based on regional variables that can influence that plant and its pollen. So the answer's everywhere. But more soon because I think we're trying to long story short, as many in the federal government have faced, there's been budget cuts, but I do think that we can come up with a new version of this that is not as resource intensive. So that's kind of where we are right now. Just trying to figure out how we can do that. But in the meantime, we are very much collecting names, numbers, addresses of anyone and everyone that would like to. Not everyone wants to collect pollen, right? Like that's a special thing that some people are going to love and some people are going to be like, what am I doing? So if you are one of those people who really like to do things like collect pollen, we would love to know who you are.
Awesome. And this is a follow-up to that. Can the pollen collection project be supported as a citizen or community science project through master gardeners or garden clubs?
So we've thought about that, and we did have some folks that represent master gardeners at our training. Really at this point, again, due to our own internal resource constraints, we're kind of hoping that someone's just gonna like take it and run. So if you know of a master gardening group that is extra eager to do things like collect pollen, please let me know. And we can try and put together a time to talk and share resources. The collection is not that hard. Despite having a 3-day training, a lot of it was not just pollen collection we were talking about because there was 4-H involved, et cetera. We were talking about a lot of other things, but it's really not that hard of a training. We do have, I say we, but Priya and Ramesh have materials put together on how to do those collections. So just let us know and we can work from there.
Great. Hopefully we've got some people on the call that are writing down your email and will be on the list. Another one, can plant nutritional characteristics be independent of soil, etc.?
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe someone on the I mean, we definitely
That's
have
okay.
soil is a huge influencer of nutrition, that's for sure. But if there are plants that aren't influenced by soil, now that's an interesting question. And I would have to ask, I can follow up. I will ask Gloria and Vanessa over in our Tucson nutritional lab, because if anyone knows, they'll know.
Great. Yeah, we'll include that one in the questions we send over. I like this one. I've got a climate background. So do you anticipate planting now for future climate?
So that's the whole thing, right? So that is like the hope of what we're doing with this knowledge graph and with all of the, and I'm sorry I mentioned it a little, I made a note to myself, mentioned Bryce's modeling earlier, talking about the knowledge graph. Thanks for being the guinea pigs for this conversation. But I mean, that's the hope, right? Is that we can go to, or excuse me, I shouldn't say we, a field office or a land manager can use this tool that we're developing to say, and looking again at like what types of bees are in that area, because we really want to make this more of like a boutique thing where you don't want to plant something if you've got a bunch of bombas and bombas don't like the plants, that are here, they might like something else. We want to make sure we're putting the right stuff in the ground, but also that it's going to be there on whatever timeline is of importance to that land manager, which could vary, right? Like, so for most USDA programs, we're thinking on like 15-year timelines. And so we've put quite a bit of effort to look at what happens even 5 years down the line with some of these plantings. And oftentimes by the 5th year, it's done. And sometimes it's climate, sometimes it's management of the habitat. Sometimes it was, maybe corners were cut with installation. There's so many things that can influence it, but we want to try and eliminate climate as much as possible in some of these plantings to make sure that at least is constant, and that it's not going to be because of drought that something is gone and not offering any benefits to pollinators on our, through our land management program. So that's a huge thing. And yeah, that's exactly what we're thinking. And so what's cool, well, there's a couple of things that are cool about this, because really what you're getting into are plant ranges, right? There's bee ranges, but then there's plant ranges. And so that's where things get really interesting, is that Bryce, for example, looks at what's happening in Mexico. So she has data for plant ranges across all of North America, and that's how she can make predictions on what's going to happen in the United States, right? Because everything's just moving north. What gets a little tricky is some of our data is only for the United States. So that makes our predictions more accurate for the northern part of our country versus the southern part. But it's still really all super fascinating. And I will say with all of that the climate models are tricky. Like I think Jenna just said that you're into that realm. Like, it is not for the weak of heart to go into the climate modeling profession, because there's so many different ways to do it. And so one of the things I love that I mentioned Sarah Gossley, but also Bryce Hanbury, they all work together. We're working with Esri's climate modelers. Oftentimes they're looking at 4, 5, 6 different climate models as they make projections. And so hopefully long-term, the goal is that we could have some, like, for the user who's doing the modeling, like in a field office, to say like, I need like 100% confidence that this is going to be a good move no matter how hot it gets, or maybe there's more wiggle room at that local level. But again, it's going to be up to the field office and what the circumstances are. But I just want to like caveat everything with how, and I don't think I'm telling y'all anything you don't know, because our weather projections have been wrong for like the last 2 years, even for what's happening tomorrow. But they're iffy, and but luckily there's lots of improvements that are happening every day in terms of the accuracy of those.
Right, thank you. This goes back to the sunflower research. With respect to the nutritional content on sunflower lines, is the omega 3 to 6 relative to pollen and seed?
Oh yeah, it's for the pollen specifically. Yeah.
And I think you touched on this. This question might have come in a little bit before you got to the slide on moving the bee populations to California, but are there any programs in place to breed native bees to release and increase populations where declines are occurring?
Ooh, that's a good question. I can ask Lindsay and also and Diana Cox Foster, I mentioned her as
Mhm.
well. So that's another one to follow up with their lab. I mean, there's
Yeah.
definitely breeding for managed bees that are non honeybees, like that's out there. I also know of programs at the US Forest Service specifically, not for releases, but what they do, this is pretty cool. It comes down to the nutritional composition of plants. So they, and it's like science free for the most part, where they have graduate students and college students go out and observe what milkweed, for example, that monarchs are feeding on. All right. And then they go and harvest those specific milkweed because it could be a stand right next to it. They always go to this one. And so they're assuming there's something nutritionally different about that stand. And so they take that specific seed to make new milkweed, right? And then they bring it back in to that very location to help and improve it. So in that way, they are trying to support local populations through very precise habitat improvements and restoration, but I am not aware of folks releasing bred bees. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And if someone knows about it, you can like pop it in the question, the Q&A. But yeah.
Awesome. This one's a kind of a two-part question that someone asked. In regards to plant nutrition to insects, are GMO and lab-created seeds containing the same nutritional value? But also what happens to the crops and plants that are being grown insect resistant? Are those affecting pollen collection?
Ooh, that's a good question. I
We've
can
got
relate.
inquisitive folk.
No, these are good questions. But you know what I can do is we have an entomologist in our pest management office that I think he would know the answer to that like off the top of his head. So number three for follow-ups, but I think I know who can answer that question for you.
Awesome. Yeah, I used to be a teacher and kids, they're like want to know all the things and you're like, I don't know, but let's figure it out together.
Yeah. Yeah, kids always
Mhm.
stump me. The hardest questions I've ever gotten are from children on bees. They're like, I mean, crazy questions. I'm like, I don't
Yep.
know. Good
Just
question though.
they have no limit.
Yeah.
This was a fun one. Why does nectar get less sweet in a drought?
Ooh, that is a good question too. I think it just has and I again can follow up with the
Mhm.
researchers. This is where to put my foot in my mouth because I didn't conduct the research. However, um, I think it's just that the plant is putting its energy and efforts into other processes that are not for the sugar production, right? And what's funny is there's the opposite has happened. I've seen as well, where if plants are really feeling the stress of not having enough pollinators, like as a last hurrah, they'll put all their effort into really nutritious nectar or pollen to attract a pollinator. So there's been some cool research on like roadside studies of where there's been huge increases in terms of like where pollinators are found in very stressed situations because the plants made this last hurrah and it worked, right? So nutrition's tricky. That's why we have a whole lab with like 10 people working at it because um, it's just that hard to understand all the caveats and nuances of it, but um, I will definitely follow up with a better answer for you.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. I know that's like I said, very inquisitive folks today. There are a few more questions, but I think that's all the time we've got today. Really, again, thank you so much, Izzy. We really appreciate you presenting today and showing us all of this amazing research. Thank you all for participating. We would love for you to fill out the feedback form, our survey. We'll get that dropped in the chat right now. And we hope to see you for our next webinar, which will happen September 24th at 1 o'clock Central Time. That is titled Tracking Shifts in Food Availability for Monarchs and Other Pollinators by Erin Posthumus, the outreach coordinator for the USA National Phenology Network. Again, thank you all so much, and we will get the email sent out and this recording posted on Friday. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you all.